My name is Sarah Keaton. I'm 42 now, but the last time my mother saw me in uniform I was barely 22, fresh out of basic training, sharp-shouldered and filled with a naive sense of honor. She had smirked at me back then, leaning over to her bridge club friends and whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "Give it a year. She'll be back home folding sweaters at the mall." 2 decades later we weren't in our family's living room anymore. We were in a courtroom that felt more like a refrigerated bunker. It was a probate hearing, a sterile battlefield where my father's legacy was being carved up like spoils of war. My father had built Keaton Aerospace from the ground up, an independent defense firm that created innovations big contractors couldn't dream of. It was his life's masterpiece. And now my mother, Evelyn, was trying to pry it out of his grave and deliver it straight into the jaws of her second husband's corporate empire. Her attorney, a slick man in a tailored navy suit with the grin of a shark, spun the story of my supposed inadequacy like a work of theater. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, his voice heavy with mock sympathy, "before you sits Colonel Sarah Keaton, a woman who has spent the entirety of her adulthood drifting from base to base. 20 years of bureaucratic postings, no home, no wealth, no experience in the private sector. She is quite simply unequipped to manage a multi-million-dollar defense contractor." I sat at my table, hands folded over a battered black folio, my expression unreadable. My uniform was gone, replaced by a tailored slate suit, my hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. Inside, though, the same cold fury that had carried me through countless deployments was coiling tighter and tighter. It was a familiar rage, one I had tasted at every holiday dinner, every clipped phone call with my mother. Evelyn sat only a few feet away, dabbing theatrically at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the grieving widow. She had always been a performer, the woman who knew how to smile for the cameras, marry well and keep the family name polished. Her husband, Victor Hale, was a defense magnate notorious for swallowing up smaller firms like a wolf circling lambs. My father had despised him, calling him a vulture in a tuxedo. Victor had once called my father a relic, insisting men like him didn't understand the future. Now, with my father gone, that same vulture was circling, ready to strip the bones of his work. The trust had been explicit. My mother and I were to serve as co-trustees. But Evelyn had filed a petition to push me out, painting me as an incompetent soldier who belonged in uniform, not in boardrooms. Her lawyer's voice rose, rehearsed and full of pomp. "Miss Keaton's career has been a life of clerical functions, auxiliary postings, support roles. We have her service file here. A dull record of transfers and menial assignments. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that suggests she has the vision or skill to run a technology company." He waved a copy of my file in the air, its pages thick with blacked-out lines. The redactions made it look unimpressive, almost pathetic. That was the point. I could feel the judge's gaze settle on me. He was an older man, worn thin by decades of family disputes that all blurred together. His look told me he saw just another squabbling heir, the lesser branch of a family tree, a soldier clinging to a file instead of a future. That had always been my mother's narrative. She was the anchor, the respectable one. I was the ghost, quiet, restless, the daughter who'd run off to the military because she couldn't find a place at home. I remembered the day I told them I enlisted in the Air Force. I was 19, standing in our old farmhouse living room. My father had simply nodded, eyes glinting with something unspoken. Pride, maybe. My mother had twisted her hands in exasperation. Then she laughed, a short, cutting laugh that I can still hear. "The Air Force? Really, Sarah? Couldn't get into a proper college? Well, at least they'll teach you how to make your bed." For 20 years that was the tone. Every step forward, every promotion reduced to a punchline. When I earned staff sergeant, she mailed me a card that read, "Climbing that little ladder, are we?" When I was commissioned as an officer, she smirked, "So they're letting you be a manager now? How quaint." She never asked about the missions, the responsibilities, or the weight of what I carried. To her, I was nothing but a wanderer with no mortgage, no husband, and nothing to show for decades of service. And in the end, she had even managed to plant that lie in my father's mind, convincing him as he grew older and lonelier, that I was simply a wayward child who'd never measured up. Evelyn and her husband's family had been ever present in my father's final years, filling the silence of his empty house with their polished version of reality. In that world, I was little more than an oddity, a daughter who vanished overseas, a woman with a strange and irrelevant profession. And now here in court my mother was using that same narrative like a blade. Her lawyer called her to the stand. She drifted past my table without so much as a glance in my direction, settled into the witness chair, folded her manicured hands, and gave the judge a trembling smile that could have won her an award. "My daughter," she began, her voice breaking at just the right moment. "I do love her. But she does not understand this world, her father's world. He built Keaton Aerospace with his bare hands. It was his life, his genius, his duty. And he trusted me to protect it." She paused then, looking at me with a mask of motherly pity. "Sarah has always been different. She wanted distance. She wanted escape. And she found it, in the military. We're proud of her service, of course, but that is a simple, structured life. She follows orders. She moves where she's told. That is not leadership. This company requires innovation, risk-taking, business acumen." She gestured delicately toward Victor, who nodded gravely like a man rehearsing his lines. "My husband has been guiding me. He knows this industry inside and out. With his experience and his resources, he can preserve my husband's legacy and take it to the next level." It was such an audacious lie that it almost glittered. My father would have set fire to his company before letting Victor Hale absorb it into his empire. He told me so more than once in late-night phone calls, his voice sharp with anger. "That man is a parasite, Sarah. He doesn't build. He consumes." Those calls had been the rare spaces where my father saw me clearly. In his final years, something had shifted. He'd stopped asking about my rank or my next posting. Instead, he asked real questions. About vulnerabilities in defense supply chains, about cybersecurity breaches, about the rumblings his Pentagon contacts had whispered to him. I'd been careful with my words, but I told him enough. "I'm not shuffling papers, Dad," I'd said once. "I protect assets. I make sure the systems that keep our people safe aren't compromised. And I make sure the ones circling us don't get too close." There'd been a long silence on the line, then his voice, low, deliberate. "Good. Watch the vultures, Sarah. Watch them close." He hadn't needed the details. He knew. That's why he named me co-trustee. I was the safeguard. And now my own mother was trying to strip me of it. Her lawyer closed his performance with a flourish. "So, Mrs. Hale, your only motivation here is to defend your late husband's legacy from an unqualified, well-meaning child of service?" "Yes," she whispered, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. "It's what he would have wanted." My attorney, a quiet and meticulous man named Daniel Price, rose to his feet. He asked only a handful of questions. "Mrs. Hale, you testified that your daughter's military career has been administrative. How did you arrive at that conclusion?" Evelyn gave a small shrug. "It's what she's told us. Always secrets, always classified. I understand, of course. But after 20 years, one would expect something tangible. A command, a title, something to show." The insult hung in the air like a blade. "Nothing to show." "So," Price pressed calmly, "you are not, in fact, aware of her specific assignments, her rank, or her commendations within the United States Air Force?" "I know she's some sort of officer," she said with a dismissive wave. "But specifics? Well, she never shared." Price nodded once, slow and deliberate. "No further questions." The judge let out a weary sigh, glancing at the clock. "It seems clear enough. Counsel, do you have any rebuttal to the claims regarding your client's lack of business experience?" "We do, Your Honor," Price said, his voice suddenly steady with weight. "We have a rebuttal witness. But before that, I'd like to submit into evidence my client's unredacted service record, along with a letter of commendation from her commanding officer." He handed a thick file to the clerk. A moment later, a copy landed in front of my mother's lawyer. I watched the man's confident smirk dissolve as he scanned the first few pages. His lips parted slightly, his color draining. He leaned toward Victor, whispering something sharp. Victor stiffened, his jaw locking tight. Evelyn's eyes flicked between them, confusion spreading across her face. The judge's brows rose higher the further he read. When he finally looked up, the tired resignation was gone, replaced by sharp curiosity. "I see," he said slowly. "Lieutenant Colonel Keaton. Impressive. Very impressive indeed." Evelyn's head snapped toward me, her expression cracking. The name, the rank. It echoed in the silent courtroom like a detonation. No longer a faceless paper pusher. A lieutenant colonel. A commander. But Price wasn't finished. "As for our witness, Your Honor," he said, turning toward the double doors at the back, "the defense calls Brigadier General Thomas Calder." The name meant nothing to Evelyn or her lawyer. But Victor's face went slack, pale as chalk. He looked as though someone had just put a gun to his chest. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open. Two men in dark suits entered first, the kind of men who looked like they'd been federal agents since birth. And between them strode a man in a flawless Air Force Service dress uniform. On his shoulders gleamed a single silver star. On his shoulders were the single silver stars of a brigadier general. He walked with an air of absolute unshakable authority. His chest was a billboard of military achievement. A rainbow of ribbons earned over 30 years of service to his country. The entire room was frozen. The court reporter stopped typing. The clerk stared, mouth agape. The general strode to the witness stand and stood without waiting to be asked. He raised his right hand. After being sworn in, he sat down, his eyes locking on the judge. "General," the judge said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect. "To what do we owe the honor?" "I'm here on behalf of one of my officers," General Miller said, his voice a calm, powerful baritone that filled the room. He turned his head and looked directly at me. There was no warmth, just a deep, professional regard. "Lieutenant Colonel Heather Ramsey." Megan was staring at me now, her face, a mask of disbelief, her perfect tear-streaked makeup, was suddenly garish. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was cracking, the foundation crumbling before her eyes. "It has come to my attention," the general continued, turning back to the judge, "that Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey's character and professional competence have been called into question in this proceeding. Let me be unambiguous. Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey is one of the finest officers under my command. She is not in an administrative role. She is a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations." A collective gasp went through the small public gallery. OSI, the Air Force's own FBI. They handled everything from high fraud and counter-espionage to felony-level crimes within the service. It was a world away from shuffling papers. "For the past 18 months, the general went on, his gaze now shifting, settling with laser-like intensity on Mark Bishop. "Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey has been the lead investigator on a multi-agency task force, Operation Steel Trap. This operation is a complex deep-cover investigation into widespread defense contract fraud, targeting contractors who have been defrauding the U.S. government of hundreds of millions of dollars by substituting substandard materials and components into critical military hardware." He let that sink in. The air in the room became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Megan was no longer looking at me. She was looking at her husband, whose face had turned the color of ash. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly open, a look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face. He finally understood. "One of the primary targets of Operation Steel Trap," the general said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard edge, "is a corporation known as Apex Defense Solutions." Silence. Absolute crushing silence. "The CEO of that corporation is Mr. Mark Bishop." Megan made a small choking sound. Her hand went to her mouth. The general wasn't done. He looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey's transient lifestyle has been a necessary component of her deep cover work on this and other sensitive national security investigations. Her supposed lack of assets is a carefully maintained professional legend. Her expertise is not in boardrooms, but in identifying and neutralizing complex threats to the United States Air Force and the Department of Defense. Threats that include financial malfeasance, corruption, and corporate espionage. I would argue that this makes her uniquely qualified to identify a vulture when she sees one." He used my father's exact word. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a message sent from him through me across the veil. The general finished. "Her integrity is beyond reproach. Any suggestion otherwise is not only an insult to a decorated officer, but is a calculated falsehood, likely intended to obstruct justice." He stared directly at Megan's lawyer, who looked as if he might faint. The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it again, stammering. The judge looked from the general to Mark, then to a terrified Megan, and finally to me. He picked up his gavel. "The petition to remove Lieutenant Colonel Heather Ramsey as co-trustee is denied with extreme prejudice," he declared, his voice booming with authority. "In light of the testimony from General Miller, which suggests potential criminal motivations for this petition, I am granting Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey sole trusteeship and full control of Ramsey Dynamics, effective immediately pending the outcome of any and all federal investigations. He banged the gavel once. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. And Mr. Bishop, the judge added, his eyes like chips of ice. I would advise you not to leave the jurisdiction. It was over. As the judge swept out of the room, the two suits who had entered with the general moved. They didn't run. They walked calmly and deliberately around the table and stood behind Mark. Mark Bishop, one of them said quietly. You're under arrest. Evelyn's scream ripped through the courtroom like metal tearing. It wasn't the polished voice she had used to charm the judge, or the carefully measured tone she had used to sell her lies about me. This was something raw, feral. A sound dragged up from deep inside her chest as her entire world cracked apart. She lunged toward Victor, hands outstretched, fingers clawing at the air as if sheer desperation could hold him in place. But one of the agents slid between them like a wall, blocking her path with a single quiet step. He didn't push her, didn't bark a command. He didn't have to. His very presence was final. Evelyn staggered to a halt, stunned, her heels scraping against the polished floor. Victor, cuffed and cornered, didn't even look at her. His expensive suit hung awkwardly, the once crisp lines crumpled and sad under the glare of fluorescent lights. His face had gone gray, his jaw slack. The man who had swaggered into this courtroom like a conqueror now looked like a hollow mannequin, expensive, brittle, and empty. I rose from my seat slowly. Years of military discipline flowed through me, every gesture deliberate, every motion steady. I adjusted the lapels of my suit jacket, smoothed the papers in my folio, and stepped into my own gravity. My heart was thundering hard enough to shake me apart, but my exterior was unshakable. Controlled. Daniel Price, my attorney, placed a steady hand on my shoulder as I passed. No words, just that quiet squeeze. It was the kind of respect you didn't need to ask for, the kind you earned. General Calder strode forward, his silver star catching the light. He stopped close enough that only I could hear his voice. Outstanding work, Colonel, he said in that steady baritone calm. Your father would stand taller than any of us today. The air in my lungs burned, but I kept my voice even. Thank you, sir. It was all I could manage without breaking the stillness that had carried me this far. And then across the chaos I saw her. Evelyn. Her mask had crumbled. The elegant bun was unraveling strand by strand. Her makeup streaked in rivers of blackened powder. The pearls around her neck hung crooked, almost mocking. And for the first time in my life her eyes locked on me, not in disdain, not in dismissal, but in shock. In realization. Sarah, she whispered, voice cracking. The syllables sounded broken, unfamiliar, like she had never spoken my name properly until that moment. I didn't know. The words drifted toward me, fragile as ash. I studied her the way I had studied enemy interrogations, measured and cold. This was the woman who had laughed when I enlisted, who had turned my service into a joke for dinner parties, who had looked at 20 years of deployments, investigations, sacrifices, and seen only a daughter who followed orders, instead of a daughter who built shields strong enough to protect the country her husband's corporation was defrauding. She had ignored every chance to understand me. She hadn't wanted to know. And now, staring at me across a battlefield of her own making, she looked small, human, broken, but I felt nothing. No pity. No fury. Not even grief. Just a deep, echoing silence where love for her should have been. No, mother, I said softly, my words slicing through the air sharper than any scream. You didn't know because you never cared to look. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. She stumbled back into her chair, clutching the armrest as though it were the last anchor holding her to this world. The agents were already leading Victor away. His steps were slow, mechanical, the clink of handcuffs echoing like hammer strikes. Evelyn reached for him again, but this time she didn't even rise. She just reached, fingers trembling, nails scraping the empty air, as if maybe she could hold on to what she was losing. But he never turned. He walked out flanked by two men who radiated inevitability. I walked past her, past the ruin of her perfect face, past the fragments of lies shattered around her. I didn't pause. I didn't look back. The doors swung open, spilling sunlight across the courtroom floor. It was so bright it forced me to squint, as though the entire world outside was demanding I step into it, cleansed and unburdened. I drew in a long breath. The air tasted different, cleaner, sharper, like a storm had finally broken. It was freedom. It was justice. It was 20 years of dismissal, mockery, and invisibility finally set ablaze. Behind me, Evelyn's sobs echoed faintly, muffled by the walls that were closing in on her life. She would remain in the wreckage she had chosen, surrounded by ashes of the empire she thought she could control. Ahead of me, the city roared, loud, alive, untamed. For the first time, I wasn't returning to duty or exile or silence. I was walking into a future that belonged to me. My father's voice echoed in my memory, low and certain. "Watch the vultures, Sarah. Watch them close." I had. And I had struck when it mattered. For 20 years, I had been underestimated, cast aside, erased from my own family's story. But today, in the cold light of truth, I had taken it all back. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Keaton. And I am done being invisible.